여러분 안녕하십니까? Thank you for Peace for inviting me to speak at the conference on peace and security as commons. I think peace ultimately does not come from elites who govern us. It comes from a civil society that thinks differently, that seeks peace, and that demands that their states act more peacefully in the world. And it seems to me that Peace Momo is advancing that cause. And so I'm grateful for the chance to offer some remarks. So for many of us, it feels like the world is falling apart. We're definitely no longer in what used to be called the unipolar moment, the era of uncontested American dominance. And in theory, that could be a good thing. In practice, unfortunately, nuclear weapons are a big part of the story of how American primacy has unraveled. And so if we think about recent historical events that have a nuclear flavor, unfortunately, right? Since 2017, there have been five major confrontations involving nuclear powers. The North Korean nuclear crisis, which I have an entire book arguing that it was the closest we came to nuclear war than any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 2020, India and China, both nuclear powers, they clashed in the Himalayas, right? In 2022, Russia, a nuclear state, invades Ukraine. And then we find out later in the fall of 2022 that there were substantial concerns about nuclear escalation between the US and Russia. Tragically, that conflict still continues to simmer in the background of world politics. And then since October 7th, 2023, we've got Israel, a state whose nuclear weapons everybody seems to politely ignore, waging war crimes at scale in Gaza. And behind Israel's nuclear shield, it conducts a genocide and ethnic cleansing. And there is always a risk that a genocidal war could spiral into a regional war. And we're starting to see signs of that. And that increases pressures for nuclear use. Last year, US Senator Lindsey Graham compared Israel's war on the Palestinians to America's bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He publicly encouraged nuclear use against people who don't even have their own state, let alone nuclear weapons. And if you recall, it was also during the 2017 nuclear crisis with North Korea that Senator Graham was also one of the leading advocates of preventive war against a nuclear North Korea. And then, if that wasn't enough, earlier this year, the fifth nuclear confrontation, Pakistan and India, both nuclear powers, fought a brief conventional military conflict. And so we are in more dangerous territory than what typically gets narrated when we read about current events. And the rising risks of nuclear war are happening in a context where the structures that hold up international stability have also been in secular decline. Regionalism, economic interdependence, arms control and disarmament regimes. These things are eroding, decaying, and at the same time, we are living through a resurgence of traditional sources of conflict, right? Great power rivalry, ethno nationalism, sphere of influence geopolitics, economic nationalism. And none of that is coincidental. The forces of restraint, the forces of cooperation, they're in decline at the same time that the forces of conflict and predation are rising. That makes a tragic kind of sense. And so rising nuclear dangers are happening within this emerging dark context. And Northeast Asia is very poorly positioned within these trends. It's a region, as we know, where four nations possess nuclear weapons, where the prospect of further nuclear proliferation among US allies is a very real threat, and where entrenched military commitments collide with unresolved historical conflicts. It is a region, Northeast Asia is a region experiencing what I describe as nuclear precarity. Northeast Asia is a site of nuclear precarity. And nuclear precarity is a condition where there is an intersection between high structural risks of nuclear use and high situational risks of nuclear use. So, what do I mean by quote unquote structural risks and quote unquote situational risks? I have to take a sip of coffee. So structural risk is the risk of escalating arms competition or arms racing. It's growing first use nuclear incentives from a strategy or a posture perspective, right? Situational risk refers to a high degree of reliance on coercive military signaling within real world crises and in the practice of international relations. So when you have a combination of arms racing pressures and a habit of coercive threat making, you have a situation with an unusually high risk of nuclear use. And I believe that describes Northeast Asia over the past decade or so. And that also explains why the 2017 nuclear crisis with North Korea felt more dangerous to all of us than other nuclear related crises over the past decade, right? The North Korea situation is uniquely perilous because it sits at the intersection of high structural and high situational risks. The question is, what is to be done about all this, right? Call me crazy, but nukes is not the answer. More missiles is not the answer. For generations, our national security establishments have lived by this ancient Roman dictum: if you want peace, prepare for war. But they have done so without any recognition that Rome was at war for most of its history. The bellicosity of ancient Rome brought down its own empire. And as the former peace intellectual, the political scientist Kenneth Boulding once said, those most prepared for war usually get it. And we can't afford for that to happen in a nuclear world. The intuition of the nuclear revolution remains true. It is the belief that nuclear wars cannot be won and therefore must never be fought. So, again, what should be done, right? Well, at the policy level, there's a mindset issue here and a policy issue here. At a policy level, we must work to seek to reduce structural and situational risks globally, but especially in Northeast Asia, right? Northeast Asia is what they call the Sinatra test. Frank Sinatra, he famously said, if you can make it in New York as a lounge singer, you can make it anywhere. And if you can reduce nuclear threats in Northeast Asia, you can reduce them anywhere, right? The Sinatra test. So we want to narrow the possibilities for nuclear scenarios to arise in the first place. We want to avoid nuclear war scenarios, right? And we do that through forms of mutual threat reduction or risk reduction, right? And that is a way of addressing structural risk, arms racing pressures. And we also want to help better responsibly manage within scenario nuclear risks, situational risks, should they arise. So, how do we do those things? Well, we have to start by recognizing that one man's deterrence is another man's escalation, and it's actions taken in the name of deterrence that will lead to deterrence failure and nuclear use. And this is a bit of a paradox, but it's true. So I was part of a big research study in 2024 that examined close to 30 scenarios in which nuclear weapons might hypothetically be used in East Asia. And in all the scenarios we looked at, nuclear use or nuclear escalation was the result of some combination of four things, four factors, right? Miscommunication, one. Two, misperception of the enemy. Three, overconfidence in the ability to coerce the enemy with military force. And four, insensitivity to the decision pressures of political and military leaders, right? You might call it a lack of empathy. And that's why I say one man's deterrence is another man's escalation. Our governments must manage nuclear policy and military related policies more rationally and more empathetically than they do now. This is like a must do. But to do that, we have to fix the mindset that leads to nuclear use. And that means thinking beyond deterrence, right? Deterrence does not keep us safe, it holds our fates at risk. Civil society is hostage to the deterrence of the national security state. Few things are more undemocratic than deterrence. So, all of our governments, especially the United States and US allies, have a role to play. Many policies to implement to reduce military spending, to reduce arms control measures, to actively try and build peace regimes that naturalize a pathway to disarmament. Many policies are needed here. And I don't want to make just a long checklist of them because that would be very boring and it would take a long time. But the principles underneath the policies we need are fairly clear, right? They are the principles that would respond to those factors I mentioned, the four factors that lead to nuclear war in the 30 scenarios that I previously examined. So those principles or those principles under our policies are transparency, predictability, strategic empathy, and then rebalancing, deterrence, and reassurance. We cannot simply make threats of deterrence. We must also reassure our adversaries of our defensive intentions, that we don't seek to conquer them, we don't seek to bomb them, etc. Right? And I think this is how we begin to reduce nuclear precarity in East Asia, right? So there's a process that we can follow here, a three-step process roughly. First, we should implement warming actions, quote unquote, warming actions, friendly rhetorical and diplomatic gestures to let enemies know that we want to relate to them in a different way. Warming actions do not involve strategic costs. They're not especially difficult to do. They do not change the balance of nuclear forces. They do not leave actors more or less vulnerable to attack, but they facilitate more meaningful actions by starting to reshape the context within which nuclear choices are made. Second, after warming actions, we should be pursuing quote unquote ripening actions, right? These are unilateral decisions that can be undertaken individually by states to unlock the political feasibility of future cooperation. They help reduce risk and alleviate arms racing pressures, but without altering the fundamental balance of nuclear forces, right? And then, third, as our political environment becomes more open to cooperation and self restraint because of warming actions and because of ripening actions, then we can propose transformative actions based on reciprocity and some degree of mutual accommodation between adversaries, right? So, arms control and negotiations, nuclear diplomacy, this comes after a process of ripening, right? And these reciprocal actions, these transformative actions, They may not alter the balance of nuclear forces, maybe they do, but they reduce the salience, they reduce the relevance of the balance of nuclear forces. And so, what I'm suggesting, and I've written about this in many places, is that there is a realistic process that we can undertake to reduce nuclear precarity. And we should aspire to live in a world where nuclear terror is not the organizing principle of life. And a lot of this burden falls on the United States because it's the largest power in the world, even as its relative power declines over time. But South Korea and Japan have a massive role to play here because it is Seoul and Tokyo's reliance on quote unquote extended deterrence, which is a mindset of dependency, of learned helplessness, even that justifies the American complex of threats and bases and military investments, all of which heighten East Asia's nuclear precarity. So it is essential that South Korea, for example, shed its extended deterrence mindset. And it's the job of civil society organizations to convince their own governments that the traditional way of providing security has failed us and it's not sustainable anyway, and that a better, more politically popular way is possible. And I talk to a lot of these governing elites, and some of them are quite cynical, quite snarky, right? They think moving beyond deterrence or reducing nuclear arsenals, they see it as full of risks. But that's not a responsible reaction given the trajectory we're on as a planet. If what we've been doing leads to nuclear precarity, then we have already failed. What we've been doing is too risky, right? And so, my message, and I hope the message of civil societies, is that, well, it's very simple. One man's deterrence is another man's escalation. Policies oriented toward increased deterrence, stronger deterrence, or enhanced deterrence, they are making the region less secure. That's an observable fact. This is nuclear precarity that is coming into view. It's a pathway toward World War III. And then a region facing compounding nuclear risks, accelerating militarization, chauvinistic rhetoric, something must be done. And minor policies of modest ambition that seek only to manage or tinker with our profound system of existential violence, those kinds of policies are inadequate to what our historical moment requires. So I hope we can all kind of work together toward nuclear disarmament, and that really begins by addressing both the policies that produce nuclear precarity and the mindset that leads to those policies. So thank you again for letting me offer some remarks today, and best of luck to the conference. Thanks.